Just a quick disclaimer, at around 50 minutes in this episode, the camera started to bug out a little bit, but the audio is still perfect, so just keep on listening when that happens, and yeah.
Welcome back to the SAR Experience with Saul and Caleb. We are honored to have Dr. Schwartz as our guest today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course.
So Dr. Schwartz, how did you end up at SAR? How did that come about?
I ended up at SAR because there was an ad in the back of the Week in Review section of the New York Times. Today, most help wanted ads are posted online, but back then, help wanted ads in education ran in the back of this one particular section of the New York Times every Sunday. And I was looking for a job, and I found a job being posted for a school that I'd never heard of in a place, Riverdale, that I'd barely heard of. And it sounded like an interesting school to teach in, so I applied.
And that's because of your previous Charedi ties, I want to say, that you were from a much more religious
Right. So I had
upbringing,
never
right?
heard of SAR, the school. The only thing I knew about Riverdale as a community was that Loehmann's was located here. Loehmann's no longer exists, but Loehmann's was a women's clothing store in Riverdale. And like women from Brooklyn used to drive to Loehmann's to go shopping. That was the only thing I knew about Riverdale.
I don't know if people know this, but you haven't been in SAR continuously. You did take a break at another school, and me and Saul are very curious about maybe some similarities and differences between this school and the other school you worked at. Happens to be Frisch.
It's funny, my children at the Shabbos table periodically will just randomly ask me, why'd you go to Frisch? And then why'd you leave Frisch? I'm like, why is this a Shabbos table conversation 10 years later? So I'll tell you, before I went to Frisch, I was at SAR for 9 years, and then I was at Frisch for 2 years, and then back at SAR for 9 years. And before I went to Frisch, the SAR kids said, oh, the Frisch kids are this, that, and the other. And then when I was at Frisch and leaving to come back to SAR, the Frisch kids said, oh, the SAR kids are this, that, and the other. And the thing that I most took away from that experience was both that the kids are basically the same and that the schools are different in really interesting ways. There's an enormous amount of population overlap, which makes sense if you think about how many families there are who've sent kids to both schools, or even kids who go back and forth between both schools. The idea that these are like two totally, completely different populations, meaning the kids in both schools might like to believe that, but that is not really true. But it is true in interesting ways that the schools are pretty different in ways that I don't think are going to be a shock to anybody who is familiar with them and knows them. And I do often think about the fact that there are kids who would do better in Frisch and kids who would do better in SAR. And it would be great if somehow we had a way of sorting kids into the schools where they would do better. But instead, our system is like wherever your oldest sibling went to school, that's where you're going to school. Or whoever had better food at the open house, or whoever's hockey team did better the year before, that's where you're going to choose to go to school. And I have encountered kids in both schools who I thought would have done better in the other school. And I wish there was some better way of sorting for that.
And just touching back on what Saul mentioned about your Charedi roots, I think a lot of us want to know how you really transitioned from that world and now to being a pillar in the modern Orthodox world.
I tell a story that sounds like sort of trite, but is actually really true. And that is, I started off in college planning to be a physics major, planning to do hard science. And I think that had I stayed in hard science, I wouldn't have undergone the same change that I underwent. But I switched as an undergrad from studying science to studying history of science, and I went to graduate school in history. And graduate school in history asks a pretty different set of questions than graduate school in physics might have. And so we asked a lot of questions about who gets authority and why and for what reason, who gets to be in charge, whose determinations are trusted. Now, in the world of science, that might be which scientists get the authority to determine what truth about the natural world is and whose authority is trusted. But there was a lot that I was reading and learning that seemed to translate to me back into the community I was in. So when you study the history of science in America in the 1940s, as I did, and you read about the ways in which women in science were slotted into subordinate roles and not given the same educational opportunities or professional opportunities or authority as men, it does have you start to think about a community that you're in that might also seem to be sorting people according to gender in terms of education or opportunities or roles, and you start asking questions, or at least I did. And the community that I was in and that I was a part of, their answers to those questions didn't really satisfy me. Now, the real truth is, at that point, I was somebody who probably still identified as yeshivish with questions because, as I told you, I didn't know what the modern Orthodox world was. So here's the part of the story where SAR comes to play such an important role in my life, because it isn't just a place where I've worked for the past almost 20 years. It was also the place that really shaped my religious formation as an adult. So I came to SAR in August of 2005 for my first teacher in service. Rabbi Hartzstark got up to give a Dvar Torah. was like, what do you mean you're giving it Dvar Torah? This is the whole faculty. Judaic and general studies, Jews and non-Jews, observant Jews and non-observant Jews. How could you give it Dvar Torah to everybody? You give it Dvar Torah later on when you talk to the Tanakh and Gemara department, because those are the people you talk about Torah to, right? And the other people are not part of that conversation. That was the set of expectations I came in with. And that was the way, before I came to SAR, I had taught in other schools, in Beis Yaakov schools, or as a general studies teacher. Even though I was obviously a fully observant Jew, there were very bright lines as to what I could or couldn't do, what roles I could or couldn't inhabit, because I was a history teacher. And I came to SAR and I learned about the grand conversation between Torah and the world, and the idea that we're not splitting things that way, not Judaic and general studies faculty, not Torah and secular studies, not any of those sorts of things. And the experience of being here and thinking about things that way and learning from Rabbi Hartstark has really been transformative to my own life, aside from being a place where I've been professionally for the better part of 2 decades.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're saying that you've been here for over 20 years, that is, correct?
Well, I started here 20 years ago, but I've worked here for 18 years because, as you've noted, I went to Frisch for 2 years in the middle.
So over those 20 years, how has the political and religious landscape of SAR shifted? And specifically for the follow-up, after October 7th, more recently, how has it changed?
Okay, so I want to back up and say something that I want to make sure, as an historian by my training, I want to make sure we don't fall prey to. And that is, there was a time in the past when things were amazing, and then they went downhill. There was a lot that felt amazing about this school in the early years because we were totally committed to a vision and a mission and an ideology. We were invested and bought in a way that now seems to me completely crazy. So just to give you a very concrete example, Rabbi Jonathan Kroll, whom we all know and love, used to oversee student activities here. He would come up with the craziest, most insane things for us to do for student activities. And at some point, he decided it was a great idea for a junior trip to be a trip to Cleveland. And in order to make it cost less money, we drove through the night to Cleveland, sleeping on the buses, and then stayed one night in Cleveland and drove through the night to Cleveland, sleeping on the buses on the way back. So the fact that you could get a bunch of 17-year-old kids to do this, I mean, you're 17-year-old kids, but we teachers slept on the buses to and from Cleveland, and we were just like, okay, that's a thing to do. I was pregnant and slept 2 nights on the bus. Michael Courtney's what, 6'7"? He slept in the aisle, stretched out in the aisle, because he couldn't fit in the seats. If you asked me now to go on a trip where I had to sleep on buses for 2 nights, I would say you're out of your mind. Of course I'm not doing that. But in the early days of the school, there was a lot of that. And so I don't want to confuse that energy and that mission-centeredness for the kids were frummer. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
I actually think that there are many ways in which the kids are visibly frummer, quote unquote, now. I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think the number of boys who wear tzitzis out. I think the number of students who are going through the kind of religious growth that we used to attribute to the year of Israel while they're still in high school. The number of girls and boys who are doing serious additional Torah learning on their own time. Tanakh, Gemara, right? Itim, Chabura, Daf Yomi, all the different ways that's happening. It's not that that didn't exist in the early days of the school. It might have. But first of all, just because the school is bigger, there's more of a chevra, and maybe it's more organized. It's more structured. There's more place created for it. It's more celebrated. All the siyums that we make as a school and that we celebrate. So I don't want to fall into the in the past things were better. Having said that, now that I said I'm not going to fall into in the past things were better, and I really think that religiously the school has always spanned a spectrum and a range, and it continues to span a spectrum and a range. And with that, again, I think there is more of a I'm using from as a shorthand. I don't think I have to do all the disclaimers about how you can be very seriously religious, halachically observant, and everything else, and be very modern Orthodox. I think of myself as very modern Orthodox, and I'm very halachically observant. But the markers of external demonstrations of more right-wing or centrist Orthodoxy, I think we see more of that in the school now than we did 15, 18 years ago. What does feel like it's very different in the school is the political climate. And I want to say it is a mistake to think this is about a move from left to right. That is just false. It's not accurate. We have data on the elections that we've done in school as students vote for president each year, and we've kept those data. When I told people that Mitt Romney beat Barack Obama in the school election in 2012 by a lot, people were very surprised because they somehow had this idea in their head that SAR was a left-wing school until Trump. It's been more of a politically mixed story all the way around. That's not what's changed. What's changed is I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know because it's true in the broader Orthodox community and it's true in the broader world, the intensity, the rancor and ill feeling. And the thing that's fascinated us since 2016 is the mapping of religious affiliation onto political affiliation. That is something that I genuinely don't remember in the early days of the school. There were kids who were politically more right-wing. It didn't also map onto which minyan they wanted to daven in and how they expressed themselves religiously. There were kids who were more politically left-wing. It didn't map in a way that it feels like it does now much more, that if I start talking to you about your politics, I'm going to know a fair amount about your religion. If I start talking to you about your religion, I'm going to know a fair amount about your politics.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like you see our polarization and dividedness. I know like it's a big thing in our nation as a whole, but very specifically in the school. I mean, even on election day, you feel the tension in the air for some reason because it feels like the school is on two different teams for that one day, and even the days leading up to it. And like we had a flag taken down because someone put up a flag supporting one of the candidates, and I do think that has changed very recently, specifically once we've also thrown Israel into the mix. So some people think if you're voting one way, then you're not maybe supporting Israel.
I mean, I think we could just say this clearly. The idea that voting for Trump is a vote to support and care about Israel, and voting for Harris or the Democrats is a vote not to support or care about Israel, adds a weight to that political decision that it didn't have when it was a question of what do I think about marginal tax rates, or even what do I think about foreign policy generally.
But what would be your solution to fixing that right now in SAR?
I am not going to solve the fact that people perceive what's best for the United States, what's best for the Jewish community, and what's best for Israel very, very differently. Don't expect to solve that. Don't even want to. What I think is really important to solve for is that if you think about politics differently than I do, you're a bad Jew, you're a bad person, you're a bad American, you're a bad human being, and for good measure, I hate you. That, I think, and that's something we've been working on in the school. I cannot promise you that we've succeeded in it, but we are really working on the idea that I can super strongly disagree with you. I think you're wrong. I think you're totally wrong. But I grant that you came to your position because you have values and you care about important things, not just because you're stupid or evil or in it for the money. And that's a position that we need to be able to hold, because the only alternative is to split the community and to split Jews and to split families and to split everything in half along political lines. And that's not an easy thing to do. We have strong feelings about politics. We're invested in them. We think they're important. Again, we think they're important for the United States, for Israel, for the Jewish community, for everything. And to say you think very differently than I do, I think you're wrong. I think you're totally wrong. I just don't think you're motivated by either bad motivations or by being a moron or whatever the alternatives are. I grant that you have values, and I might even share those values, and we just understand how they play out in the world differently, or we interpret them differently. That's where I think we need to do the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, most people obviously won't know this, but you were obviously one of my teachers in politics, philosophy, and economics, and I think we saw, like, that was one of my first classes where I really saw civil discourse come into place, where we would discuss very heavy topics, and we would even discuss the debate, which I think is very important that we did. We were not forced to, but it was like an assignment that we had to watch the debate, had to be educated on it. We would even talk about maybe selling kidneys or something, and that should be okay. And that was the first class in SAR where I was like, okay, this is a very safe space where anyone can really say whatever. I mean, maybe not whatever they want. There's obviously a certain extent, but where it doesn't feel so divided. And even if it is divided at points, nobody is going to hate you for saying something. It was a very respectful conversation, I would say.
I'm really happy to hear that, because that was very much a goal in the course, to be able to have those kinds of conversations in that way. Again, even when we're very divided in important ways and about important things.
Yeah, and Mr. Courtney also said how now the civil discourse curriculum is being expanded from 11th grade to pretty much to the whole school, which is very crucial. And something you touched on was how the perceived SAR, liberal leftist students. So when people say the SAR administration or institution is too liberal, too progressive on certain issues, what would your response be to that?
And the question about that, do you think that a school, a co-ed school, a modern Orthodox school in the United States in 2025 should have women teaching Gemara to co-ed classes? Do you think that a co-ed school, modern Orthodox school in 2025 should at least have, in certain circumstances, opportunities in which girls carry the Sefer Torah or recite a Mishaberach during Tefillah? Do you think that a co-ed school, modern Orthodox school in 2025 should openly support its gay and bisexual students and lesbian and bisexual students and say, you are welcome and embraced and members of our community, and we want to create spaces in which you feel safe? If we move away from affixing a political label to those, oh, that's left, oh, that's progressive, I don't agree with that, I'm not there, and we talk about values, I think we can have a conversation that's a much more meaningful conversation. Somebody thinks that the goal of embracing and welcoming and maximizing the way we use the talents of all the members of our community is the most important goal. That's a great goal. And somebody else thinks that the goal is upholding and maintaining tradition and the way the Jewish community has historically done things. And that's also a great goal. And then we can have a conversation about why I prioritize this goal over that goal and you prioritize that goal over this goal without it being, oh, you just want to keep the women down. Oh, you want to destroy the religion. Let's rip each other's throats out. And so, again, I'm going to come back to the same thing that I feel very strongly, and I'll connect it to my family story in a minute, which is there has to be a way for us to engage with each other across deeply held, deeply felt, really important differences in a way that's not, oh, the only reason you could hold that opinion is because you want to destroy Judaism, or the only reason you could hold that opinion is because you hate women. How about if I believe that I have values and you have values, and we even both might agree with each other's values, and it's only a question of how do I calibrate and to what extent and what do I prioritize, and then we can have a conversation. And the way this connects to my family story is that my entire birth family is in the yeshivish Charedi black hat world, which means they don't share my values about, we share values about a lot of important things, about Torah, about mitzvot, about, right? But they don't share my values in certain important ways, in ways that directly affect my life and their lives. And we have done a lot of work together to navigate staying together in family and loving each other, and also navigating places where our differences make that not always easy. And again, there are choices. We could ignore them and not talk about them. We could break the family and never speak to each other again, or we could say we're working through this together, but we're part of a family. You said, civil discourse space for every idea. Sometimes what happens is that people are like, well, what if a Nazi? Okay, yes, that's right. I don't believe in civil discourse for Nazis. We don't have Nazis in our high schools, and we don't have Nazis in our shuls, and that's not a help. We don't have Nazis in our families. That's not a helpful framing. That might be useful in talking about American political discourse where there are Nazis. What room should we make for Nazis? Or, Hamas, or whatever you want to say. But, that's not true in our families, in our communities, in our school. We're not dealing with Nazis. And so to always go there just shuts down the conversation about, no, what if it's somebody whose views I just really disagree with, but they still should have some place within our community or some voice, or at least I should be able to interact with them, even if I don't think their views should have a place in our community, but they exist in our community. So now what? And that, for me, is really what needs work in our school, is what needs work in our Jewish community.
Yeah, so we're talking about the right course of action when we're disagreeing and there's differences, but I am curious, what similarities are there between the Charedi and modern Orthodox community, if there are any, if you had to say?
Look, at a base level, there is a commitment to learning Torah, keeping mitzvot, Jewish continuity, keeping the Jewish people going, believing in the value of all of that. And I would very much like us continuing on our theme of staying in community with people with whom we disagree. I would like us to be at a point where we acknowledge that those things that we have in common are bigger than the things that divide us, even when the things that divide us make things feel very hard. So to jump to your post-October 7th, I'll give you an example. Obviously, the Charedi community in Israel, men do not serve in the army for the most part, and the Charedi community in America is very supportive of that, of men not serving in the army. My siblings are living in a totally different reality that I'm living in. My siblings do not know anybody who serves or has served in Sahel. They don't know anybody firsthand. And I have dozens of former students who serve in the IDF. And that completely changes how you think about, relate to, experience what's going on in Israel. And for some people, especially people in Israel right now, that is so painful and so raw for very real reasons, right? When religious Zionist families' sons are dying in war, or even if they're not dying, they're being called up for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tours of duty with all the disruption and risk and fear that entails. And Charedi young men are not going through that. That brings real ruptures in the community. And I hear that and I acknowledge that. And at the same time, can we say, even as big as the things are that divide us from our Charedi siblings in America, that our core commitments to being part of the Jewish people, to Torah and mitzvot, unite us and join us. And we all know that we experience this in certain circumstances or in certain ways, right? If you are in the hospital, which I hope you're only in the hospital for, good things. I guess the only good thing to be in hospital for is having a baby, so maybe not yet. You could hold off on that for a few years. But if you're in the hospital and you need kosher food and you all know there's going to be a room set up and staffed by Chesed 24/7, which is Skvera Chassidim, or the Satmar Bikur Cholim is going to bring you food. And we all know that Jews whose practice of Judaism is very different than ours and whose beliefs are different than ours are still going to say, you're a Jewish person in the hospital, you need help and support, I'm going to provide it to you. We all know there are ways in which as a community we find those points of connection, But too often in our day-to-day conversation, it's all those people are and those people are. And I really wish we could find a way to do less of that.
Do you think that Charedim should be serving, or is that too much of a close-to-home subject?
I'm going to say something that's totally not original, okay? This is completely not creative or original. I don't think the real issue is they think their Torah is supporting the state. I mean, I think people genuinely do believe their Torah is supporting the state. But it's clear right now that there's a need for people in the army, and that might be surmountable. Not everybody will sit and learn Torah. Some people sit and learn Torah, some people will serve. The real issue is that army service makes it extremely difficult to maintain that level, not just of commitment to halachic observance, but there is a deep commitment to shelteredness from the broader world. And an army base is not a great place to stay sheltered from the world. So here's a conversation I was having with my sister this morning, okay? She was talking about the need to go online to set up certain kinds of accounts for her young adult sons. And I said, in a moment of forgetfulness, why don't you just email them the link and have them set the accounts up for themselves? And she said to me, they don't have smartphones. There are no internet computers in their yeshivas, right? They are not in a context where they have any access to the internet. These are American Charedi boys who are significantly less sheltered than Israeli Charedi boys. You're going to take those boys where there's a huge investment in maintaining, honestly, purity, which is not a concept that we in our community talk so much about or act like we value so much, and dump them in an army base, probably not the world's most pure environment, I'm just guessing, and that's going to have the impact it has. And until and unless that is resolved in some way, and I'm not sure it can be, the essential sense that service in the army is a threat to the commitments that they've invested so much in maintaining is like a pretty difficult thing. Again, on the other hand, the religious Zionist communities who are sending their sons to fight and die or be injured seriously or just serve call up after call up after call up, at a certain point they're like, I don't really care if there's internet or secular music or pornography on an army base. Can all fall on my son, who's also a yeshiva student, who also would like to be home learning Torah. I don't have great answers to this, but yeah.
I just want to circle back because we were mentioning the Gershon article before the podcast, and we're going to have him on the podcast, so we don't want to, we keep repeating that topic, but do you think that there is a censorship line, and maybe what would that be? Because, you know, Rabbi Harkstark spoke in front of our whole school saying that they're like basically saying that there's not free speech, but we want to maybe get close to it because you can't have full free speech in a private institution. So what do you think that line would be?
Yeah, I assume you're assuming that your listeners know what the Gershon article is.
I assume that they
We don't
know.
have to do that whole background. I don't think that Rabbi Harkstark was saying we can't have full free speech, but we want to get close to it. I don't think, to be perfectly honest, I teach this to my students all the time, right? You have no rights in a private school, and we're not particularly trying to give you any in that legal sense, that you have a right that you can legally enforce or insist upon. What Rabbi Harkstark was saying is that there is a range of views. Certainly there is a range of views in the Jewish community in Israel that is wider than the range of views that is acceptable in the Orthodox community or the modern Orthodox community in the United States. Across the Jewish community in Israel, and even across the religious community in Israel, there is a wider range of views expressed and in circulation. Rabbi Harkstark was saying that a view that is within the range of views that is articulated and expressed within the Jewish community in Israel should be articulable in our school. Many, many years ago, I heard a scholar named Tamara Kaufman-Witte say something that really has stuck with me since then. She said that when you have a diasporic population, you have a population in diaspora, sometimes the way that they prove that they are loyal to the home country is by being more hardcore and rah-rah than the population in the home country has to be. Because the population in the home country, their commitments are not in doubt, right? And so the example she gave was actually not in Israel at all. You may or may not know this. You are too young to know this. When I was a kid and you heard about a bus bombing, terrorists blowing up a bus, the city that the bus bombing happened in was London, and the terrorists were the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. There were Irish independence activists who wanted Northern Ireland to be independent from Britain, and they engaged in terrorist activity, bombing, blowing up buses, all kinds of things, assassinating people, whatnot. And the IRA was funded in large measure by donations from Irish Americans in Boston who were funding the IRA. Now, why are Irish Americans in Boston funding terrorism in England or Northern Ireland? Because they have to prove that they're still super loyal to the home country by being even more hardcore, right, than the Irish in Northern Ireland have to be. So I think there is something of that phenomenon among American Jews, certainly among American Orthodox Jews, where whether we feel like our loyalties might be in question or whether we feel some residual guilt that we're not living there or we're not serving or we're not just nosei ba'ol, we are not carrying the load together with those people in Israel who are getting red alerts and incoming rockets and running. And so for all of those reasons, maybe we feel the need as a community, or maybe because we feel threatened by the people around us in a way that we hadn't before October 7th, or maybe for a lot of reasons that we as a community feel a need to, to really, really double down. And what I think Rabbi Hartstark was saying is, for all that we as an institution are a proudly Zionist institution and committed to the well-being of Israel and the Am HaShochein B'Tzion, the Jewish people who live in Zion, for all of that, there is a broader range of opinions and perspectives that can be heard within our community than is currently heard, and that should be an okay thing to do. And I was beyond fine with the people who really, really strongly disagreed with Gershon. It wasn't like he wasn't aware that he was saying something that would get people to strongly disagree. People should absolutely strongly disagree, right? The fine ends when there were some kids who seemed to take that to a level of personal attack, whether verbal or even, there were threatened physical things, although I don't think anything of the sort actually happened.
Good.
But that kind of thing is like, no. Somebody saying that we should hear more Palestinian perspectives or be more empathetic to the suffering of Palestinians does not call for either saying, he should be expelled from the school, or certainly not for saying, I'm coming to find him, where is he?
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to that line where you said how it's a private institution, you don't have rights, because very hot topic or contentious issue more amongst the girls' population is the dress code, and people really think that it's like a theocracy when it comes to that issue. So what would you say when people are like, the dress code's unfair, yada yada, all that stuff?
Wait, it's what when it comes to that issue? I didn't hear the word you
like
said.
A theocracy.
Oh, a theocracy. We're a theocracy when it comes to every issue. Just to be clear, we force you to go to davening every morning. We force boys to put on tefillin. So just to be clear, we're a theocracy when it comes to every issue. Here are a few complicated things to say about dress code. The first thing to say is that obviously it lands more heavily on the girls than on the boys. Okay, a collar. When a boy starts with me on a collar, I just roll my eyes so hard they fall out of my head.
And pants.
Okay, I don't know if we want to say this for publication, but our pants enforcement is so lax as to be virtually non-existent.
I mean, we wear Lululemon joggers.
Yes, all of these, like, whatever they call it, technical fabric joggers that are sort of in between sweatpants and not sweatpants, and we can't tell what they are. And anyway, the women aren't allowed to enforce pants on the boys. And then by the time you're done with it, the boys are wearing everything short of sweatpants to school, and sometimes they're even wearing sweatpants to school.
I wear sweatpants every day.
Now that you're done,
too late now, you can't catch them.
So the whole thing is like, I actually think we need to get control of the pants thing, but that's a different conversation. The dress code lands much harder on girls than on boys. I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge, I am being very honest with you here, that we in a school are not in a good place with the dress code for girls, and here's what I mean. Everything else we do institutionally, I think, we have really worked through what our values are and our religious commitments are and the ways in which our dress code is completely consistent with those values and those commitments. The idea that girls have to wear skirts all the time is not a commitment of the school institutionally or the people running it. I wear skirts all the time in school, out of school, when I'm hiking in Idaho, but that is not the case for everybody in or connected to the school. I was once interviewed on a Charedi podcast about dress code, and the interviewer, I was talking about what our dress code is, the interviewer said something about, like, so they don't keep halacha. I said, no, there's a different understanding of what halacha requires. Right? That's why you have there's a particular profile of a religiously serious modern Orthodox married woman, which is she's covering her hair and wearing pants, right? Does not hold la halacha that wearing pants is a halachic problem. So why as a school do we make girls wear skirts? We can give a lot of different kinds of answers to that. Certainly it is the case that it is still the norm in our community that in religious institutions women wear skirts. I think it's still pretty uncommon, even in fairly progressive modern Orthodox schools, for women to show up in pants on Shabbos. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is it's pretty not common. That women generally wear skirts to shul, so maybe it's partially that, but maybe it's also partially just some kind of communal expectation that schools should ask girls to wear skirts. And so I think even if girls can't quite articulate it, there's something about that that feels like with every other thing we do, you can say to us why you deeply believe in this as a practice or a value, as a commitment. And here it's like, that's the thing we do in modern Orthodox schools, girls wear skirts, and that doesn't feel as compelling. It was actually a big aha moment for me because I came to SAR from a different world. And the norms and practices of that world are still the ones I uphold in my own dress. There's no reason you would know this, but for years, I used to wear the T-shirt to the Salute to Israel parade, like a short-sleeve T-shirt, and I would wear a long-sleeved white T-shirt underneath because I don't wear sleeves above my elbows. And then at some point, I found out that Ms. Bloom in the academy was ordering three-quarter sleeves T-shirts for a few teachers at the academy who also wanted to wear a longer sleeve T-shirt to the parade and didn't want to have to wear two T-shirts to the parade. So I was like, oh, how do I get in on that, on the three-quarter sleeve T-shirt ordering? So now I got a three-quarter sleeve.
We have one for this year?
I do have a three-quarter sleeve parade T-shirt this year. Thank you so much for asking. Yes, get in on the three-quarter sleeve parade T-shirt. So when I say those are still the standards that I dress according to, they are. But it was and therefore, to be perfectly frank, I was very comfortable enforcing the dress code because it made sense to me as the standard that we follow all the time in our lives. And the high school that I went to, which had a much more demanding dress code than this one does, the expectation was that you wore that dress code not just in school, but on Sunday and in August and wherever you went. And if you didn't, there could be consequences if you were seen out of that dress code, not just in school, but on Sunday or in August or wherever you went. The point at which I realized that the dress code that we're asking students to wear here is not the dress code they wear outside of school. It's not the dress code their mothers wear outside of school. It's not the dress code necessarily their Torah teachers wear outside of school. And so that makes it a much harder thing to make any sense. And aside from the questions of surveillance, and aside from the questions of body image, and aside from the questions of gendering, I think at its very core, that's a piece of what's troublesome about the dress code. And I'm telling you now that I can't solve that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'm one that I think the dress code should be stricter, in my opinion. I personally see my own effect. When I'm one that doesn't do the dress code, honestly. I wish I did, because when I'm in sweatpants and a hoodie and Uggs, you wouldn't think it, but you actually do. You feel like a bum a little bit, and when I wear like a quarter zip or nice pants and shoes, you feel more into it. And I was also in my Jewish identity class. It happened to be a very female-dominated class, and I would have the controversial opinion that, like, why can't you guys just wear longer skirts? And I don't know. There's no, real reason for it, and I don't really get what the issue is, if I'm being honest. I get maybe it's not the norm outside of school for them, as you were saying, as it was when you were a kid where you were wearing it year-round inside of school. But I feel like, why wouldn't you just wear the longer skirts? I really don't see the issue.
Yeah, I'm very much in agreement with Saul, and we are having Lior Blechner and Nicole Freeman tomorrow, and we will definitely be asking them this question, so it's good that we're getting the faculty and the student side. But
I mean, I am definitely team, why can't you just wear longer skirts? I am the person who does dress code enforcement, but I guess I'm also team understanding why for girls in our schools and this community, a little bit it feels like this rule just exists in this space, and I see boys all around me. I have said I have said many, many times to my male colleagues on the administration, that the lack of enforcement of boys' dress code makes it much harder to enforce the girls' dress code. Yeah. Right? There are many pieces. I've been talking to you about the school values piece and the ways in which the dress code doesn't really reflect all of the ways in which we think halacha plays out as a school, and so that becomes complicated. So there are a lot of different pieces there. There's definitely also just an equity of enforcement piece. If more men in the school were more consistently enforcing the sweatpants, collar, kippah, on boys, then even if girls still felt singled out, or they felt like talking to girls about their skirts creates a gendered or a male gaze or some other kind of aspect that's uncomfortable to them, or a surveillance or whatever else it is that doesn't feel good, it would feel a little bit more fair. And when it feels like girls get dress code enforcement and boys less so, then the fairness also becomes an issue.
Yeah. On the topic of rule enforcement, would you say that RPT and ISS are effective ways of dealing with people breaking the rules?
I have to assume that you imagine this podcast is only being listened to by SAR people, because it doesn't seem like
heavily SAR, but there are definitely others as well.
I mean, I had the whole TABC baseball team tell me about this podcast.
I can't imagine they're going to know what any of these things mean. The answer is we do track things like how many people get how many RPTs, which is a lunchtime detention, and how many people get how many ISSs, which is after school or on Sunday morning coming in for, honestly, just to be annoying. It's meant to be a deterrent. The whole point of ISS is to be annoying, and we succeed at that. And so we track it, and we know that under the systems that we have now, we have a pretty good rate of compliance and people doing what we want them to do, and that the systems are working in that sense. Over my years of working on this, we've recalibrated and readjusted many times, so that I will give you a concrete example. It used to be that if you came late to or missed davening, you got a lunchtime detention called RPT. And there was no further consequence beyond that. And so we had kids who said, that's worth it to me. I will skip davening every day, and I will sit inside during lunch every single day, and I will take that trade. That was years ago. And so we calibrated that after you get a certain number of RPTs in a month, the consequences escalate. So it doesn't become. And then we created this consequence called ISS, and then some kids just said, I'm not coming. What are you going to do? So we said, oh, we need to have a consequence that escalates if you don't come to ISS. So there's been a lot of thought and attention paid, and the short answer is yes, monitoring the numbers, seeing what it looks like, seeing who the frequent flyers are, seeing how many kids get how much, how many consequences, we think it's working. Here's where we still think there's work to do. You ready here where we still think there's work to do? We've been thinking and talking a lot. We could get into my substance use survey, and then we could spend substance use survey. It's not my substance use survey. And then we could spend a lot of time talking about that. But one of the things that the data from the survey have shown over the years is that students feel, and again, this is not just students in SAR. The survey is done by kids across almost 24 modern Orthodox schools.
What is the survey?
The substance use
Oh,
survey.
Well, no, we've talked about it a lot.
Yeah,
on
with
podcasts.
Mike, the guiding
Great.
choices.
So it asks about substance use. It asks about mental health, emotional well-being. It asks about connections to adults around you. Teachers answer your questions. Your parents answer your questions, all kinds of things. And one thing that's emerged from the survey is that students feel that the school does not recognize them when they do the right thing. And that's something that we've been working on institutionally for a few years, being better at noticing and recognizing kids when they do the right thing. But it is still the case that we are much better at communicating when you do the wrong thing. We have heard from parents many times, I hear you say, that you want to work on recognizing kids when they do the right thing. So once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year, I got a communication home, your kid did the right thing. And then every week and a half, I'm getting your kid missed whatever period class. You have an ISS. If this is a mistake, please contact us. Your kid wasn't in dress code. Your kid was late to tefillah. And that flurry of emails, which are automated and help us run a school of close to 700 kids. And we need still feels to at least some parents and students like just a lot of background chatter of negativity. And one of the things we're working on now is, can we rewrite those emails to make it sound less meh, 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 meh? Can we somehow keep a system that we think is working, which I told you is the case for us right now, without it feeling like kids and parents hear from the school all the time about negative things and very rarely about positive things.
You mentioned the substance abuse survey, and we touched on this on the episode with Michael Corney, but it's very real that not just SAR, but the whole modern Orthodox, Yeshiva League community has a higher drinking rate than the public school community. Apparently, the drug rate is lower, which surprised me and Caleb, but what do you think leads to that? And do you think there are maybe solutions to fixing it? For example, Jacob Madoff said that he thinks it would be better if there was just like a talk with the ninth grade students and their parents, and they just said, if you are ever in trouble or while you're intoxicated, you should feel free to call me. Stuff like that, just making the community more safe. Or do you think it's more about preventing it?
Okay, so there's a lot here. Let's take this one thing at a time. First of all, it's important to say that we have very good data about what the problem is. When we get into the realm of why, I'm speculating about things that I don't necessarily have data about. So I want to be very careful to distinguish between what I know and what I can make hypotheses about. We have done surveys of thousands of kids across the Yeshiva League in 2019, 2020, 2023, and 2025. When I say across the Yeshiva League, I mean, we sometimes say the range of schools that play in Yeshiva League sports. We sometimes say the range of schools who march in the Salute to Israel parade. So that goes from Berea, JEC, SKA, DRS,
Eula?
Central, MTA, Ramaz, Frisch, SAR. Like, we're talking about the range. Eula also, shall have it in LA also, a number of other, Ida Crown in Chicago, a number of other non-New York schools, Katz and Boca. It's not just New York area schools. And across the entire survey, we see, as you said, really significantly higher rates of drinking and really, really significantly higher rates of binge drinking, which is really concerning. Binge drinking means 5 or more drinks at a time, which is just unhealthy behavior for anybody and especially unhealthy for high school students. So that's what we know. What do I think? Here are a few things that I think. I think we are a community that has resources. I only learned this once I started working on prevention work, whatever it was in 2018 or so. In the United States, I did not know this, alcohol consumption rises with income. I don't know if I would have guessed that, more well-off people consume more alcohol.
Yeah, Mr. Courtney's talked about that.
Yeah, he's talking about higher socioeconomic status.
And you're probably familiar with in your communities, in your homes, in wherever, high status bottles of alcohol, expensive, good wine, whiskey, whatever it is people drink, right? Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing is obviously we do have a culture that supports drinking in religious contexts, and it's not that hard to have it blur over. Another thing is that Shabbos creates a time in which I'm not allowed to smoke. So obviously you could consume edibles, but marijuana in some forms is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. Drinking is acceptable. I know I'm not driving. I'm not operating heavy machinery, as the wine bottle says. I don't have to go to work. It creates a space where if I want to, drinking is more possible and even supported. Our kids have access to alcohol. And then across the community, we start to see differences. So we think of drinking in our part of the community as kids who are super stressed and under a lot of academic pressure and blowing off steam. The head of an all-boys school who's a leader in the modern Orthodox educational community in the United States said to us that in his school he feels that it's more like boys getting together on Friday night at a tish, and it's in the guise of some sort of religious activity. So it might manifest differently in different parts of the community, but the problem is the problem. So when I think about ways and reasons that's happening, that's what I think about. Now, in terms of the tackling of it, and again, you can tell me if Mr. Courtney spoke with you about this, when we started to think about this, we didn't know the first thing about prevention work, literally not the first thing. The only thing we knew was that kids in our community seemed to be partying in a way that was concerning. And again, at the time, we really did think that marijuana was also going to turn out to be a very significant problem. We learned about something called a public health approach. And the idea of a public health approach is that it's not primarily about shaming or punishing or yelling at or whatever offenders. It's about changing the context in which use happens. So that might be everything from kids need something to do in the winters on Motzei Shabbat when Shabbos ends at 5:30 and you have like a whole night stretching ahead of you and nothing to do. And if you're bored, and two, what's the access that kids have if parents are keeping large amounts of alcohol around, unlocked, unsupervised? You're giving kids access. Let's think about access. Two, have parents ever directly communicated their values to their kids, said to their kids, this is what I think about you and alcohol, and this is what I want, and this is what I'd like to see. All kinds of different ways that as a community, we can change the culture around alcohol. And that is an intervention that SAR High School has been working on for quite some time now, together with a number of other high schools. I could talk to you about that if you want, or not if you don't want. But the idea is of a public health intervention of trying to get a community to shift how it relates to alcohol and it relates to kids and alcohol, instead of just, if I find out that a kid did, then they will be punished.
Do you think that there should be steps to making kids understand? You might argue that this is promoting it or maybe making it seem okay, but for me personally, I think it's somewhat inevitable. You might disagree with that a little bit, but to me it seems inevitable that kids are going to drink. So do you think that there should be programs, for kids in school to make sure they're making good decisions like once they've already done it?
Okay, so here's the thing that's a little funny to me. Can I tell you a thing that's a little funny to me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We do that twice in your high school career. And kids all the time ask me if we're going to do it. And I'm like, we do that twice in your high school career. In 10th grade health, where we talk about substance use and substance consumption, we also talk about things like what do you do if somebody gets dangerously intoxicated, and what we talk to girls specifically about the problem of sexual assault when girls are under the influence of alcohol, and safety in that regard. If you're going to be going someplace and drinking, here are ways you can be relatively safer under those circumstances. I hope they talk to boys about not sexually assaulting people, but I don't teach the boys' health class. I teach the girls' health class. And then it comes back again in 12th grade. So this is, I'm just going to let you in on a general high school frustration. Would you like to hear a general high school teacher frustration? That's not what you asked me about. I'm going to share it with you.
Yeah.
A general high school teacher frustration. I really genuinely love my students a great deal. But when kids come back after high school and they're like, why did you never tell us about? Why did you never teach us about? And you're just thinking to yourself in your head, we did. That was the curriculum in 11th grade Mach. That was the curriculum in 9th grade Gemara.
How about Helfgott loves to talk about that.
Now, here's the thing that I also think is true. I'm just expressing a frustration. That's a feeling. I'm not saying that's right. Here's the thing that I deeply think is true. I think if we taught students something and they didn't learn it, that's not just a student's problem, that's a teacher's problem. It's not good enough to say I taught the lesson perfectly, the student didn't learn it. I think if we're teaching it and you're not learning it, that's something we have to think about. We think about that a lot in SAR. What's the message? How are we giving it over? So you, for example, you are the 12th grade. that had a 10th grade Shabbaton, the subject of which was?
Swimming in the oceans we swim in, or the water we swim in.
Okay, so we talked about technology.
Yeah.
And it was a giant flop.
Oh yeah. Oh, I
Yeah.
so
That
remember
particular
that you're talking
Friday
about.
night.
I will
Vartor-
never live that
Yeah.
down as an educator. I will never hear the end of that. A great flop, right? We didn't say, well, the kids didn't learn about technology from us the right way. We redesigned it again for the next year. And when we didn't like the way it worked the next year, we redesigned it again for the year after. As a school, one of the things I'm very proud of is that we don't just say we did it right, let's keep on going, or we didn't do it right, it's the kids' fault, let's keep on going. We are really reflective and thoughtful about how to do things better. So I'm not saying this to express that it is you guys' fault that you don't remember it. You guys is Brooklyn for a plural of you, just so in case you didn't grow up in Brooklyn like I did and you don't know what that is. I'm not saying it's your fault for not remembering. I'm expressing a frustration when students say, why didn't you teach us? And it's something that we in fact taught you multiple times in high school. It comes up very often when kids come back from yeshiva in Israel and they say, whatever, this limud, this sefer is such a great limud, is such a great sefer. Why don't we learn that in high school? And we say, we did. In high school, you weren't ready for it. You weren't open to hearing it. You were too busy thinking about other things, your college transcript, your video games, right? Your social life. And then when you're in Israel, you were ready to hear it. That's great. That's amazing. I'm so happy. But it's a little hard to hear. Why didn't you teach it to us? So I'm just expressing that as a frustration, even as I acknowledge that if you didn't hear it when we were saying it, maybe we need to say it differently. So 100% yes. This is not, I say this all the time about the interventions that we do. The idea of a public health intervention also is we're going to lower the level of problematic behavior. We don't think it's going to be zero, ever. And the idea of a public health approach is that we also teach harm reduction. And harm reduction means if you're going to do it, here's how to do it safer, and here's why it's better not to do it. So I'll give you an example of a harm reduction approach as opposed to a no one should ever do anything ever, right? An abstinence approach. It is very clear from the data that the longer students delay starting to drink, the safer they are. It is safer to start drinking at 16 than at 15, and safer to start drinking at 17 than at 16, and safer to start drinking at 18 than at 17. So when I talk to my students in my health class about alcohol, I do not say do not drink ever. That's not the value. That's not what I'm trying to convey. I say for every 6 months that you delay onset of first use, you are more protected against becoming a problem drinker. So if you're in 10th grade, which you are when I'm teaching you health, think about not about never ever drinking. I'm not going to drink this year. You make it to 11th grade, let's think about not drinking until next year. The goal is not never ever drink. The goal is how can we keep you safer? And keeping you safer doesn't include talking to kids about what if you do drink.
Yeah.
You just don't seem to remember that we talked about that.
Yeah, I think you do see.
But now that you mentioned it, I do remember how there was like a whole level of like how much drunk you'll get from this much and how much you'll get drunk from that much. So.
Yeah, we did talk about blood alcohol content. I do remember that. But I also believe that, as you're saying, the issues lie more with the younger kids. Like in our school, if you have kids starting to drink in 9th grade, the freshman age seems to have a lot more, I guess, maybe blackouts, maybe issues, people getting picked up from Hatzela because they don't know how to control themselves. And then it probably does like a trickle-down effect, feed down to them later in life because they think, oh, like I wasn't safe then, I don't have to be safe now maybe. Do you think that's what it is? Or do you think, because in my head I'm thinking, oh, obviously nobody should be starting drinking earlier, but if you started drinking earlier, theoretically, you would become safer. But why do you think
that's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows because your brains are still developing, you've heard this from us 50,000 times, your brains are still developing. The more that your brain develops in the presence of a substance, the more it develops to need and crave and want that substance. If a kid is drinking and drinking heavily in their younger years, they are more likely to become a problem drinker. I say to my students all the time, you absolutely can be a responsible adult consumer of alcohol. You can be a responsible adult consumer of cannabis. That same Charedi podcast that I was on to talk about dress code, I was on another time to talk about our drug survey. I think they like having me on because I'm like the token, actually modern Orthodox person who comes on their podcast. And the only thing they edited out of my podcast was that I said you can be a responsible adult user of alcohol and you can be a responsible adult user of cannabis. And they censored that. They wouldn't let me say you can be a responsible adult user of marijuana for some reason, even though everybody acknowledges you can be a responsible adult user of alcohol.
I feel like in the Charedi community, they also do a good amount of drinking.
Right, so they were willing to have that,
and
but not the marijuana
also,
one.
I feel like.
They weren't willing to have the marijuana. I'm just telling you, this was the fact that happened. They took out the line about cannabis. They left in the line about alcohol. I think it is possible to be a responsible adult user of both of those things. I don't have a problem with adults responsibly using substances in responsible ways. it is a fact, medically established, that the younger you start using a substance, the more likely you are to develop a dependence on it. It is not true that if I get all of the blacking out of my system in 9th grade, then I'll be a safer drinker by the time I'm in 12th grade, even though plenty of 12th graders have said to me, oh, no, we know how to drink. We do it safely. 12th graders say this to me all the time. Or you know what else they like to say? Here's another thing kids like to say. I've been partying hard since whenever. So by now, I know how to handle myself. It's these goody two-shoes who decide to get drunk for the first time after college admissions, and they don't know how to handle themselves. I'm really not sure it's
You ever
fact.
see 12th graders that never drink
It's
previously
facts that
visit
students
colleges?
say that to me. I'm not sure it's facts, but it's definitely facts that students say that to me.
I mean, this might not be the best thing to say, but I feel like, especially going into college, if you're going to certain schools, kids that haven't done anything before college might struggle in the beginning of college to maybe find their limit, quote unquote. Wouldn't you say that?
I think that is probably true, but to me, the solution to that is not to get blackout drunk in high school. To me, the solution to that is to do education, to have parents talk to their kids about values, to talk to their kids about concerns, to talk specifically. I mean, there is data that shows that the time that women are most vulnerable to sexual assault on college campus is in their first semester and their beginning of freshman year, because they do not understand culturally what's going on and how at least some of the men on campus with them are conducting themselves and how campus culture functions, and they don't yet know what steps they should be taking or shouldn't be taking. So to me, there is a lot of education, a lot of values transmission by parents, a lot of guideline setting when kids are younger to help everybody arrive at a healthy relationship with substances, rather than saying you should get blackout drunk at some point in high school so you're ready for college when you get there.
And you mentioned how you talked about us on the Charedi podcast, and unfortunately the Machun Siach data does not cover the Charedi world, but from what you know, being in that world, or I've been in that world, is this an issue that's prevalent there?
So here's a super interesting thing. Again, I don't have data, so I want to be very clear about what I know and what I don't know. I have both observations and things I've heard from people, including somebody named Rabbi Tzvi Glock, who runs an organization called Amudim. So Rabbi Glock, who runs the Amudim, it's a substance use organization, has said that he has data about this in the Charedi world. I keep meaning to reach out to him and ask him where his data come from. I don't know. It is certainly clear that there are significant drinking issues in that world as there are in the modern Orthodox world. My sense is that they are much more gendered than the drinking issues are in our world. For better or for worse, what our data tell us is that although modern Orthodox girls drink somewhat less than modern Orthodox boys, it's not a lot less. My sense from the more yeshivish Charedi blackout world is that there is a much stronger gendering of the drinking issue. That it is much more men and boys than it is women and girls. But I think they suffer from many of the same issues of high socioeconomic class leading to availability and opportunity, of things around Shabbos, and certainly another, aside from observations of people in that community they've shared with me, things like there are a number of English language Charedi magazines, which might be super interesting for some of your readers to pick up. I brought them into my identity class this year. The three of them are called Bina, Ami, and Mishpacha. And when they write about problems in the community, one of the kinds of stories they'll write is the young wife whose husband goes off to shul on Shabbos morning and then goes to Kiddush in 3 different people's apartments. And by the time he rolls in for the Shabbos meal, quote unquote, he's too drunk to come to the Shabbos table and falls asleep. That's a kind of thing you see described, which I imagine if they're describing it is a phenomenon and not a one-time thing. My sense is, and this I do not know, my sense is that there is some kind of an age shift there, where again, we're dealing with a problem in high school, a serious drinking problem. Most of these articles that I've seen are about, young men in their 20s, but that doesn't mean there isn't a high school problem. It just means I might be less aware of it. I don't know, I'll decide if I want to censor this out of the podcast later. I was at one of my nephew's B'nai Mitzvah, where his older brother, my other nephew, who was a 12th grader, got completely drunk at his younger brother's bar mitzvah, and then came over to me to say, my nieces and nephews know about some of the stuff I do, came over to me to say, Tante Rivka, something about the data, your survey, whatever, while he was completely drunk at his brother's bar mitzvah. So, yeah. I'm
going to be honest, I assume they don't listen to our podcast, so I think it'll be okay.
I don't think they listen to your podcast.
We touched on, the different roles of women. You're talking about how the drinking is more male dominant in the Charedi community. But at SAR, do you think that there is a gender dynamic that needs a shift, or maybe has shifted to a point where it's better now with Rebbe culture or boys and girls having tissues together? I don't know if I'm articulating myself well, but
I don't think I'm going to have a simple answer to that, because I don't think this is a thing that you fix and solve. I think it's a thing you pay attention to and think about. I think we've been very thoughtful at SAR, both about maximizing opportunities for women within the constraints of Orthodox halacha. We have a mechitza, men get aliyot, men lead the davening. I find also in talking to my nieces and nephews, they have no idea what the dividing line is between modern Orthodoxy and non-Orthodoxy. So when I say things like I have there's a mechitza, women don't lead davening, they don't actually understand what the differences are. So within the limits of Orthodox halacha, we want to maximize the opportunities for women possible, and we recognize the value in many different ways for both boys and girls in having single gender spaces. And thinking about what that looks like, and we recognize the importance for boys and girls of having opposite gender role models. I don't think it's okay to have boys in some schools in our broader modern Orthodox community who grew up never encountering women as teachers of Torah, disrespecting women's ability to learn Torah or contribute to teaching Torah. I think it's important that everybody see that teachers of Torah, and same gender role models and the kind of connections that those can foster are also really important, and we have to cultivate them. So to me, I don't see this as SAR has moved in the direction of Rebbe culture, or SAR has moved away from single gender. We did a lot of thinking about Tish on School-Wide Shabbaton. We actually considered, I don't know if anyone shared this with you.
We talked about it there about
Great. We considered doing single gender Tish on School-Wide. Because I love you dearly, because of the way the boys sometimes turn.
We get rowdy.
I don't think it's rowdy. I think it's a particular kind of celebration that dominates the space and makes the girls feel like they are an adjunct to the boys' party. We spent a lot of time thinking about how to make the Tish feel and look different. And we felt really good about the way the Tish landed on School-Wide. And we've been doing these Tishes in different homes and different communities that are single gender. So both of those things. We said, we're right, Tish on School-Wide, that's a really big front and center opportunity. We don't want that to be separate gender. And we do think there have to be other kinds of separate gender spaces, and we're working to create both. And I'm not going to tell you we've solved this or we figured it out or it's right. And I also think it shifts and it changes, right? You're all familiar with, you're both. Like a ton of talk right now about young men in America, and young men trying to figure out what it means to be men in America now, and who are you going to be your role models for how to be men in America right now, right? And it shouldn't be Andrew Tate as your role model for how to be men in America right now. But then who is and how do we create that? And in that environment, in that context, we might say we need a shift towards some more single gender opportunities for boys and girls. And then there might be other times where we say, right. So it's a calibration and a thinking through. It gets back to what I said earlier, that we don't just say, well, we've gotten this figured out, we do it right, so now we can keep doing the same thing for the next 30 years.
Yeah. A lot of these topics we're talking about, you're coming from the perspective of a principal. But from what I heard, you're the principal that teaches the most classes as well. I don't know if that's true, but you definitely do teach a lot of classes. So how is that balance and maintaining relationships with students as a principal, but then being their teacher as well?
Oh, the kids tell me all the time, I was so scared of you until I had you as a teacher. Because
me.
you're the dress code, RPG,
well.
ISS, whatever lady. And then I had you in the classroom. Look, it takes a lot of time to be in the classroom. It especially takes a lot of time to be in the classroom well. So it's a reasonable thing to say that maybe an administrator shouldn't teach as much as I teach. I also try very hard. I have seen sometimes in some schools where administrators have a class, but then they're always so busy they don't go teach it.
Well, I mean, we as a member of your class, we'll get a few emails. Hey, class, sorry, can't make it.
Right.
Very last minute.
Right. That is a thing that sometimes happens, and we try very hard to have the class actually function as a class. It's not completely avoidable. We try very hard. You can tell me if your perspective of it is different. My perspective of it is that actually the classes I taught, and there were classes, and it wasn't like I never show up because I'm busy being an administrator, and then there were times where I'm dealing with an emergency situation, and we're not going to have class today. So whether the calibration is the right calibration, we could think about, but I actually think it's very important to stay in the classroom because I think, again, going back to this resting on laurels thing, kids' realities are changing. I started in SAR before there was an iPhone on planet Earth. And then there was a period of time when there were iPhones on planet Earth and we weren't really thinking about them or concerned about them in school. And now we're in a period of time where there's been this mounting wave of concern about kids and their devices and everything else.
New phone policy, yes. Yeah, we talked about it a little bit also.
Right, our phone policy that has been shifting week by week or sometimes day by day as we try to figure out and as many schools and in many sectors try to figure out what's the right way to think about this and manage this and navigate this. And what are the realities that kids are living in? And I think you understand that much more if you're in the classroom with kids on a regular basis.
Do you think that phones have shifted the social dynamic of SAR in any way, with kids walking up and down the halls, walking up and down the stairs, glued to their phones instead of interacting? And do you think that maybe with a new phone policy, it can improve? Because me personally, when you're sitting around on our grade floor, most kids are just on their phones, and I think it's a bad thing, but I'm not gonna like go up and tell people to not go on their phones. So do you think the social landscape will change with the new phone policy?
Yeah, I think there are a few different things going on. One is I wish people wouldn't be on their phones on the stairs just for traffic flow reasons.
Yeah,
That's a different thing.
Yeah.
That's just traffic flow. I do think I see it in myself. We've gotten bad at being in any one thing at once, right? The phenomenon of people being in movie theaters watching a movie while they're on their phone.
That's insane to me. I never understand it.
Yeah.
Like-
It's also very frustrating for me when like I recommend a movie to someone and they have to go on their phone for a sec. Like, watch a movie.
It's
Shut
like-
your phone off before the movie.
It's like you can't be in any one place at once. Obviously, we see it in people driving also on their devices. Probably not the best thing. That was a joke. It really is for sure not the best thing, right? There's a lot of I can't be in any one place at once, so I even can't be in one place with my friends at once, and I think that's not a great thing. I also see, I have a 13-year-old son. As much as my nephew doesn't want to be cited on the podcast, my 13-year-old son even more doesn't want to be cited on the podcast. And I see that, yes, and he socializes with his own friends on his phone. So they'll be playing a video game together on their phone. He's not playing with random strangers from wherever. He's playing with his friends from class, and the phone facilitates that. So I don't think it's quite as simple as phones are bad for human interaction or phones are good for human interaction. I think there's a somewhat more complicated story here. Having said that, I absolutely agree that creating things like lunchtime as a phone-free space that we could sit and talk to each other is a good thing. And I also want to acknowledge, I appreciate now in ways that I probably didn't 20 years ago. The people who become teachers are usually people who are good at school and liked school. I just think that's the truth. I'm not going to tell you it's 100% of the time, but generally, people who choose to spend the rest of their lives in school are people who are good at school and liked school. We got positive messages about ourselves from school. School worked okay for us. There are kids for whom school is agonizing in a lot of ways. For some schools, it's agonizing because of the academic demands. It makes it hard for them to meet. But for some kids, it's agonizing because the social demands and expectations of school are hard for them. They don't have someone to sit with during lunch. And that's so, we hear about that from parents. My kid, it's often my daughter, but my daughter doesn't have anyone to sit with during lunch. And she feels so awkward and uncomfortable, either like going over and asking a chevra if you could sit with them or sitting by herself. And then that technology becomes like a socially acceptable way to navigate that discomfort. Now, you might say maybe we should have other ways. The Hawks should help her find kids to sit with during lunch. Fair enough. But I think understanding that it's just not as simple as technology is bad or technology is good. And that technology can both be, I'd rather there be much less tech during lunch and tech be put away and kids talk to each other. And also for a kid who doesn't feel like she has an obvious group of people to talk to, the phone can help manage that and deal with that is just a thing we need to be aware of. I really don't, the one thing I really don't like is the kids these days with their TikTok and their Snapchat and their, and they never talk,
It's Rabbi Helfgott. Nobody hates phones more than Rabbi Helfgott.
He has the best analogy ever. He takes your phone if you're on in class, will stick it into your vein and goes, it's heroin, it's an addiction.
Yeah, Rabbi Helfgott does believe it's a drug, which she might be right.
Yeah, so I actually am again, I'm not the person who's here arguing for all of us being on Snapchat all day. I also think there's just a more complicated story to tell. And we have to think about how we're interacting with these devices and how we're not interacting with these devices. It's not, heroin, there's not really any positive use case for heroin. Although there is positive use case for opioids, right? Under a doctor's supervision and prescription. Not really a positive use case for heroin. But that means, I think, thinking about this, I do think, just to be very clear, to lay my cards on the table, I'm a huge believer in delaying onset of first use. L'shitati, I'm consistent. My oldest didn't get a smartphone until he graduated from high school.
Damn.
It's
Wait, but your oldest, when did phones come out for him?
No, there were smartphones ready. He's 25. And then my second got a smartphone when he was a senior in SAR. My third got a smartphone between 10th and 11th grade. You could see my youngest got a smartphone in 8th grade. But still, there are many kids in our community who have phones long before 8th grade.
Yeah, I had mine in 5th.
And
I was in 8th grade.
I have very robust parental controls on my son's phone. It is locked down and locked up, and what he can do on it is very limited.
Yeah, I mean, Caleb, I don't know if you remember this, but Caleb and I and some of our friends would go out to dinner when we were in Miami together and put our phones in the middle to, get off our phones for a little bit, which I think is good, but I think it's also kind of somewhat sad that we have to do that for us to not go on our phones.
Right, so that's the human interaction piece. But actually talking about limiting kids' access to phones and limiting what kids do on their phones gets back to Charedim in the army and the purity piece. The level of exposure that we take for granted among our kids. I know you didn't like it when I talked about it on 10th grade Shabbaton, but the level of exposure that we take for granted among our kids did not exist 15 years ago simply because it did not exist. And it does now, and as a community, I think we're going to have to decide that's actually something we think we can and should tackle instead of just throwing up our hands and saying, this is the reality of being a middle schooler today, is that every kid has an unfiltered smartphone and they do whatever they want with that. So it's not as though I think when I say a more complicated story than just good or bad, I don't think we should be handing kids unfiltered smartphones in 5th grade. I really strongly don't think that, have not done that with my own kids. But I also think that in thinking about technology, the good, bad thing doesn't really think about what it does, what we want it to do, how we can use it. And then we have to do what we try to do about everything else, which is come up with an intervention, try it, see if it works, adjust if it doesn't, and keep on going.
Yeah. Back to the social dynamics point, you mentioned how it's actually a mother usually calling about their daughter rather than their son. I'm curious why you think that is, that maybe it's the social dynamics with the phone and cause a little more problems with the female population and the male population.
You think girls are a little more cliquey? Is that it?
I wasn't actually saying the social dynamic with the phone. I was saying the other social dynamics for which the phone can become an amelioration. Like when the social dynamics are difficult, then if I don't have a group, the phone can become
Okay.
Okay. Here is a thing that some researchers argue, and I'm not convinced that I believe. I'm just going to tell you, okay? So a lot of discussion of like girls and their social interactions and boys and their social interactions and how they're different and mean girls and queen bees and all this kind of stuff. That's fair enough. I think many of us who work with teenagers recognize some of those patterns. There is some argument about something, inherent to being female or to being a girl or to how brains work or use language or everything else. That's the part I'm not totally convinced by. I don't know how much of this is biology or innate and how much of it is acculturation. Girls are taught to interact in certain ways and modeled to interact in certain ways, and boys are taught or modeled to interact in certain ways. So I'm sort of agnostic on the question of whether this is biology or culture. But either way, we do see different patterns. And again, there are some boys who interact in patterns that are more typical of girls and some girls who interact in patterns that are more typical of boys. Great. By and large, we do see some patterns that are different in social interaction. It's also true that there are certain things that here's a double negative, maybe a triple negative. It's not the case that there are no girls who are sports fans. There are some girls who are sports fans. But that is much more...
Mom. Sorry, my mom's a huge sports fan.
Great. Some of my daughters are. Well, one of my daughters is. So there are some girls who are sports fans, but it's much more common among boys. And if you don't have anybody to talk to or anything to talk about, you can always talk about fill in your favorite.
It's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
that is very true.
It becomes an opening, a social opening, a conversation starter. What happened at the game last night? What was the trade? Well, I hope it's not what we bet on. That's a different conversation we could go back to, or not, given how
Never
much.
bet.
Given how much time we've already been here, we have data on gambling also. That's a big problem in our community too. But that becomes, I think, a natural. That's not to say that boys are nicer, kinder, or friendlier. I think there are ways, right? I think boys' unkindness sometimes manifests differently than girls' unkindness. I think, unfortunately, both groups of kids can be unkind. I also think that's the teenage condition. It's our job to help people grow into realizing that being a kind human being is really important. But I think there are ways in which girls' social dynamics, I'm hypothesizing, can make it harder for a girl who doesn't have the group that she's in, or maybe she just feels it more acutely. It is an observation of mine that most of the time we get phone calls from parents about my child doesn't have anyone to sit with during lunch. It is parents calling about a daughter.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't even have this on the agenda, but since you opened up the floodgates, it's obviously male dominated, but with gambling, I assume you would agree that maybe it's because of online betting, which is a big thing,
Absolutely.
and making it so accessible.
The Supreme Court ruled now 7 years ago, that states could not ban online gambling. That's what happened.
But it's not allowed in all states. Like, it wasn't, you couldn't go on, I'm guessing, DraftKings Sportsbook and bet in New York State or go to the online casino because it was illegal in New York.
Until the Supreme Court said you can't make it illegal in New York. That state law can't make it illegal in New York. Now you can go on FanDuel, DraftKings.
But you said that was 6 years ago, that they said they couldn't do that.
They said states can't ban it 6 years ago. I'm not talking about, I don't know, right. That changed. Before that, there was actually a time, my children, not that long ago, when you watched a baseball game and they didn't have a little graphic of the odds floating in the corner.
I mean, it's also
and when
so
every
pushed.
sports podcast wasn't
It's
being
free money to
sponsored, and
them.
every
Yeah.
ESPN wasn't being sponsored, and everything wasn't being sponsored, and it sounds a little quaint, but people were once banned from sports for life for betting on the
The White
sports,
Sox.
Still happens, yeah.
and
Well,
now
that
they're
was
like, don't
them
bet
fine.
on your own game, but
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what was that? Oh my God, I totally forgot.
There's
what
even
I
been
was
like
saying.
pushes for like the Yeshiva League sports books. People try and get that going.
yeah,
So,
I think that's
yeah.
horrifying for reasons that I'm happy to discuss. But I do, going back to the values conversation and dress code, I actually think this is an area where we have very clear values, and it's very hard to articulate to students. I think the reason why I think it's bad to gamble, kids can understand that it's bad to gamble if you get into so much gambling debt that you lose your parents their house. Like, kids get that.
I mean, there was a real example in the community. I even
Yes, that does happen.
saw it, a TikTok of it recently, of the therapist talking about it, and it was like this kid made $800,000 of bets, was pawning off his parents'
Right.
stuff.
So but kids can understand why that's bad. But the question of why is it bad for me to just bet on the next pitch, the next at bat, I keep using baseball metaphors, but you could bet on the next whatever it is, or what's going to happen in the next game in the Yeshiva League, or what the outcome is going to be, or betting on everything. Why that's bad if I'm not ending up in huge amounts of debt and I'm not losing my parents their mortgage payment or their house. The reasons why that's bad, I think we have a harder time articulating and talking about. And that's something that both as a school and as a broader community, I think we need to work on, given how prevalent the problem of gambling has become. And it's also interesting, by the way, because I talked about phones not really being an addiction. This gets into a little bit more in the weeds, maybe, of what addiction researchers think does constitute a dependence or doesn't. And I would push back against the characterization of phone use as an addiction. Gambling very clearly does function as an addiction in the brain. And that itself, I think, is concerning, even if you don't lose your parents their mortgage payment. But even if you don't become addicted in that way of, like, I was waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning to make more bets, which you do read about, I'm just concerned about the idea that to me, it's actually not hugely different from I can never watch the movie without also being on the phone. I can never talk to my friend without also being on the phone. I can never enjoy what I'm doing unless I also have money bet on it.
Yeah, that makes
And
a
also
stake on
because the kids that are betting, the kids that we're referring to that are betting, they don't have like their own incomes. I'm gonna be honest, like,
Right.
my parents won't let me sports bet, and now that I'm seeing more of the effects of it with people around me, I'm somewhat thankful. I'm very thankful. But
Somewhat thankful.
but my dad explained to me that when you have your own income, you can do what you want. But as of now, you don't have the concept of money, which I think is very real. And these kids are betting maybe with camp money or maybe even their parents' money. And I think that's also a huge issue, that kids not understanding the value of money and the value of loss. Because if you lose money as a 16-year-old kid, what's going to happen? You know?
And I think also a big problem is I think there's a difference if you're someone who's a hardcore NBA fan, you know a lot about the NBA, and then you see there's good odds on something and maybe throw some money on it. But then you have kids that they want to bet on everything, so they'll find a ping pong game, a cricket game.
Like
They're not
next point
that they don't
ping
know
pong.
anything about. They're just gonna throw money on it because it's another thrill they can have for that night.
And there, I think it really starts to speak to the idea of that your brain craving that next thrill, and that starts to become concerning in a whole other way. Meaning, I might even be concerned if you're a huge NBA fan and you can't enjoy the NBA game unless you have a financial stake in it, but that's already a different conversation. But again, it's hard to. One of the things of having lived long enough to whatever it is, my son who's 13 now, once came to visit the school, and I don't remember what conversation we were having about when I started in SAR. I don't remember what I must have said about that we didn't have Wi-Fi in the school. And my son said to me, well, what did you connect your iPads to? And I was like, well, you really don't understand. We also didn't have iPads, right? You had a computer, maybe when I was working on my dissertation, you had a computer wired into the wall with cables, right? We didn't have Wi-Fi. What did you connect your iPads to? So having lived through a time when like things were actually different, and here it's not that long ago. You're talking about just the late 2010s when the Supreme Court issued this ruling. And before that, these sites didn't exist. You could go bet on sports in Las Vegas if that's what you wanted to do. But it wasn't every ad, every billboard on Route 4, every game you watch, and so saturated and pervasive. I guess similarly to the phones, it feels like, whoa, this tidal wave just came in, and we're not quite prepared to deal with it or respond to it. So we'll get there, but there is going to be a generation or half a generation of kids, which is you, who are going to be, overrun by that tidal wave before we figure out how to respond to it.
I mean, every single, even just random videos on Twitter I see, the bottom of it says stake, which is like an online betting thing.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
just very oversaturated, which I think is a huge issue.
And again, there's also a thing that's very disturbing to me, which is not just, again, ESPN, mainstream sports sites are now all
ESPN has
ESPN
its own
bets,
betting.
right. That's what I'm
ESPN
saying.
bets,
They
yeah.
are all either benefiting from it or they have sponsorship deals. They are in on it. They are contributing to it. And then they put out a disclaimer that somebody says really fast, if you have a gambling problem, dial 1-800
Yeah.
whatever. But that doesn't
Some
really
very
address.
little gray letters.
Right,
at
Yeah,
the bottom.
exactly.
now the new thing is putting the gambling things in the arena, which is going to be a whole another issue soon.
Yeah.
A lot of money is about to be lost. But
Yeah, I really that, and I think that there's a point, and it's not a very far point, where you are preying on people's addictions, and it's really harmful and really terrible. That's a different story, right? How I feel about the NHL doing that is one thing, but I also have to think about my students and not only the ways in which they're harming themselves, which I care about, but also how are we doing some kind of education and values education around things that we think are, good and not good, and how are we communicating that to kids and to their parents, and so that's all
yeah,
still
You
to be
know,
done.
I don't know if everybody knows this, but Dr. Schwartz was on Jeopardy at one point.
I was in Jeopardy.
And I was wondering if you could take people through that, because I feel like you don't talk about that as much as you should, because in my opinion, that's a huge flex.
Okay, so I will tell you, I did not do as well as I wanted to on Jeopardy, and for some time after, I was enormously embarrassed, actually. So you think of it as a huge flex, I was enormously embarrassed. It is just a reality that you come off of Jeopardy and then spend maybe it's not a reality for everyone, it was a reality for me, spend tons of time afterwards thinking about, I knew that question, or I knew that answer, or if I had managed the buzzer better,
It's
or
like a
anything
test.
else.
You
Isn't
walk
the
away from the
buzzer
test.
really weird? Like if you needed it exactly at a certain
Right,
point.
and they warn you about all of this in advance, and you know all of this, but your ability to execute in the moment.
It's like, don't press the red button. You can't do it.
So I actually, one of the reasons I didn't talk about it is because I really did not feel good about it for quite some time after I had done it. And then when I got to the point where it was far enough in my past that it was just, oh, that's like a fun fact, I sometimes use it as a Shabbaton fun fact, but don't really talk about it anymore. One of the more interesting things, well, there's two things about my stint on Jeopardy. One is they film 5 shows in a row. So you show up, you don't know if you're being filmed for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then they call you for the show while you're sitting there. And I knew the week, they told us the week they were filming for, I knew the week was the week of Purim. You film it a few months in advance. And I knew the Purim was Thursday. And sure enough, they don't call me for Monday, they don't call me for Tuesday, they called me for Thursday. So the Jeopardy show that I was on aired on Purim afternoon. So like from the Purim Suda, there are people who went to watch the Jeopardy show. My kids went across the hall to a neighbor and they're like, can we watch your TV? Mom is on Jeopardy. And the neighbor's like, whatever. That's of course not true. And then they turned it on. They're like, oh, your mother's on Jeopardy. And the other thing was that I was on Jeopardy in a hat, and it actually became for a minute. Okay, Twitter was very different then, right? Twitter now is like intensely political in certain ways. And Twitter then was really just people schmoozing about whatever random moment we were all living through at the same time together. And people, I guess, didn't like my hat or thought my hat looked stupid or whatever. And like people on Twitter were all the lady with the hat on Jeopardy. And I was in Frisch when I was on Jeopardy when it aired, and some of my Frisch students kind of like went on Twitter to defend me. The whole thing was cute. But Alex Trebek was very interested in Orthodox Jews and in talking about Orthodox Jews. And after our filming ended, he wanted to talk to me about Orthodox Jews and the community, and all the little flunkies who had to get ready for the next taping of the Friday show were like, just to get off the set, just to get off the set, we have to get the next people in. And Alex Trebek just wanted to talk to me about Orthodox Jews.
Yeah, you mentioned Twitter. You definitely had a very active Twitter account at some point. I think now in recent times it's not so active. Get us how did that happen?
Okay, so I'm basically completely off Twitter. I say basically because once every 6 months I surface to respond to something that
You
someone
gotta look
tweets
at
at
Twitter
me.
every now and again.
Yeah.
But I'm basically completely off Twitter. There were 2 phases to that. The first phase was Elon Musk buying Twitter and a change in the tone and tenor of Twitter, and the change in what that was supporting, what my being on Twitter was supporting, because when I'm on Twitter, I am creating content that doesn't drive any money to me. It drives money to somebody who's not me, and thinking about that. And then post-October 7th was I went much, much, much quieter on Twitter after that, and then post-October 7th, I stopped on Twitter entirely. And I definitely think about it. I had a meaningful following on Twitter, and I actually felt like I was contributing something to the communal conversation. I did sometimes tweet about SAR High School color war. That was something I tweeted about intensely. Maccabi, I'm sorry, Maccabi. I tweeted about intensely for 3 weeks, 3
Was
days.
that in your bio?
It was in my bio. It was in my bio. That's why I set up a Twitter account in the first place. 1 year in Maccabi, there were like points for the team that tweeted the most. Again, when Twitter was much younger and it wasn't a political debate platform or whatever, it was just people randomly sharing what was going on in their lives. And so each team had a Twitter account and whoever tweeted the most, whatever. And so I set up a Twitter account actually for that. That's what I started it for. And then I started being more active talking about other things. And I was part of various sub-communities on Twitter. So I was active in certain kinds of political conversations. I was also active in the pretty, I mean, I don't know if it's a pretty small world, but in the world of from NHL fans. So that was like a fun set of Twitter conversations. But then I was also very active in some conversations within and about the Orthodox community. And one of the things that social media is great for, and this goes back to my it's not all bad, was elevating voices that didn't otherwise have a way to be heard in the community. And there were times when I tweeted about things that we as a community don't always think about, whether it's women in the community, LGBTQ people in the community, disability in our community, and would get responses from people who said, oh, I never thought about that, or I never heard anyone express that perspective, or that helps me think about things differently, in ways that I actually felt like I was contributing to the community conversation in a way. And so when I stopped, it actually felt to me like a loss of something. It did. I stopped anyway for the reasons I thought that I should stop. But it has felt to me that community has not been recreated anywhere else. Threads, Blue Sky, whatever. The community that once existed on what we called From Twitter has not been recreated anywhere else. There still is a From Twitter. There are people who are part of it. I am not. It's, but every so often somebody will like return to or retweet a conversation that a thread that I posted 3 years ago, and I feel like that was actually a useful thing to say out into the community to a few thousand people who were reading it and who might do something with it. And it does. It feels like a loss that I'm not doing it anymore, and I'm not doing it anymore.
Yeah, I could definitely say as a Twitter user, post October 7th, it's been a little rough in the Twitter world, but at least we can always look back on your previous tweets. They're up for good unless you deleted them. I'm assuming you didn't.
I feel like it has to do with lack of censorship, though. Because
there
used to be a lot more censorship on Twitter. Like, you couldn't just say whatever you want or post whatever you want. Like, Shane Gillis, I don't know if he's a stand-up comedian, he has this bit where he's saying the whole war in the Middle East is just on Twitter.
It is.
You could watch people die in the war on Twitter whenever you please. And you just see like these Arabs blow up something and be like, oh, look, we blew something up. And it's all on Twitter. And I get what Elon Musk is trying to do, although I do believe that maybe you shouldn't have people getting blown up on Twitter and saying whatever you want.
Yeah. You mentioned how in Jeopardy a lot of people were interested in the hats, and even in our own school and our community, we're very enamored with the hats. So I think we wouldn't be doing the viewers justice. We didn't ask, when did the hats really become your thing, and how big is the hat collection?
That was our favorite question.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've been looking forward to this the entire time.
So when I was engaged to be married, I was in a hat store with my mother, and I wanted to buy hats. And my mother said, Rivka, you're never going to wear hats. Every engaged girl buys hats because she thinks she's going to wear hats, and then you're only ever going to wear a sheitel, so I'm not paying for the hat.
Is that why you wear the hats? She told you wouldn't?
No, I was an adult by then. I was in graduate school. I was not just being difficult to be difficult. I bought that hat with my own money because my mother was like, she was paying for everything else in my wedding. She wasn't going to pay for that hat. I still have that hat. I still wear it today. I just want to tell you. 25, 6, whatever number we're up to years later, almost 26 years later, I still have that hat that I bought at that time myself because my mother was like, you're never going to wear a hat. I'm not going to. In the early years that I was married, I had a sheitel that I sometimes wore, but even then I more often wore a hat. I was in graduate school in a secular environment. So the answer to how it started is there are plenty of people, plenty of married women who cover their hair, who wear wigs in secular environments specifically because they would like to blend in more. I actually didn't want to be in a situation where somebody would be like, oh, married women don't cover their married Orthodox Jewish women don't cover their hair. Rebecca never covered her hair. It'd be like I was actually wearing a sheitel and they just didn't know. So I always wore hats to graduate school from the very beginning. And at that point, I switched off sometimes to wig, to a sheitel. It's important to know that in, again, my family of origin, all married women wear sheitels. Wearing a hat is a weird, strange thing. That, too, gives my more Charedi nephews something to talk about. I have one hat that I wore to some family occasion, some simcha or something, that my nephew... You see, you only see the low-key hats. You don't even understand.
These are low-key
The
hats?
Shabbos hats are much more high-key. They have feathers. They have things coming off of them. They have all kinds of stuff. So my nephew said about one of my hats that it looked like an explosion in a chicken factory because of all the feathers all over it. I don't know if that was meant as a compliment, but
brutal honesty.
I actually love that hat. I wore it to his bar mitzvah. I was like, here's the explosion in a chicken factory. So I wore them from the beginning. And again, for a while, I switched off with the sheitel, but I stopped the sheitel pretty early on. At this point, I put on the sheitel once a year. Sometime in Adar, I wear a sheitel to SAR High School. When we do Crazy Hat Day in Adar and everybody else wears a hat, I wear a sheitel. That's the bit.
That's a good bit.
So I own a sheitel, but I don't ever wear it, and that's the hats. And then as the years go on, because you don't outgrow hats, and because hat fashion doesn't really change the way clothing fashion changes, you can wear hats that you bought 25 and 22 and 20 years ago in the rotation all the time. So over the years, the hat collection has really grown. So I have a number I tell people, but I actually have no idea if it's correct or not. Meaning, I say I have about 60 hats. I have no idea if that's true or not.
I was gonna say more.
I could
60's a
possibly have
lot.
more.
How
I've
do you
never
have room
counted
for-
them.
How are you keeping 60 hats?
I don't know
And they're
if-
not just they're not like baseball hats. They're hats that are pretty big
and
in
they all
size.
have to be kept in hat boxes because otherwise they get crushed and smushed. So all of my hats live in boxes. So the answer is there is a twice annual changing of the hats. The hats that, because there's summer hats and winter hats. I don't know if you knew that, but there are summer hats and winter hats.
Obviously.
So the out of season hats just get stacked in a closet. All the hat boxes stacked on top of each other. You can't access them. They're stuffed away. And the in season hats get taken out and put on shelves, and then they get switched twice a year.
That's great. I've always wanted to know that. So to end off our podcast, we want to ask you, do you have, I mean, obviously you're an administrator, so this might be tough, but do you have any critiques or shifts that you would want to see in SAR that haven't happened yet?
There's a big shift that I would like to see in SAR. I don't know if we have the ability to make alone. We haven't talked about at all so far. The intensity of the focusedness on college as the end game of high school, I think is not just not good. I think it's actively harmful in a lot of ways, and I think it's really not necessary. Kids in our community will all be fine if instead of going to school at the top of their list, they go to a school 2 rungs down, whatever your list is. If instead of going to school at the top of your list, you have to bust your tuchus for 4 years to get into, if you go to the school 2 rungs down, that you could have a normal life and a normal social life and normal hobbies and a normal sleep schedule and do well enough to get into that school, you're going to be fine. You're all going to get into professional schools. You're all going to get jobs. You're all going to be fine in life. And this idea that the existence in high school is meant to be this frazzled, frenetic, anxious, killing myself, taking courses I'm not interested in, doing co-curriculars I don't like because they'll look good on my college transcript, spending a year, the second half of 11th grade and the first half of 12th grade, writing admissions essays and crying myself to sleep at night at what some 27-year-old in the admissions office is going to think when they read my, you're hearing that I have very strong feelings about this?
Yeah.
And I am just going to tell you the truth. I have been trying to sell this to my students for years and decades and have almost not succeeded at all. There's almost no student in the school who says, I could get into this school up here, I don't know if people could see me, way up here, but I'd rather shoot for a school that's 2 rungs lower that I know I'll get into and live the life I want to live and take the electives I want to take and sleep at night and have friends and have a life. I've convinced almost nobody for reasons, probably some of which we have to take responsibility for. I'm not going to blame it all on you and your families. We'll take responsibility too. And it's our kids, and it's their families, and it's the community at large, and it's I don't know what. We have all bought into a value system that I think is both harmful and unnecessary and shapes so much of my students' experience. Years and years ago, I had a student who, guess what? She went to Penn. I was teaching, at the time, I was teaching AP US Government and Politics. And she came to ask me if she should take AP Gov or AP Euro. And I took one look at her and I said to her, are you asking me which you would like better? Because then I can talk to you about what we teach in Gov and what we teach in Euro. Are you asking me which looks better for college? In which case, I'll just tell you Euro, and we're done. And she was like, great, thank you. And she walked away. And she took Euro.
Yeah.
So this is a student who was a great student in AP US in 11th grade, which I also taught her. And she might have been a great student of AP US Gov, and she might have been really fascinated by US government, and she might not have been interested at all in AP European history, but that is definitely considered to be a more rigorous AP and looks better for college. And that was the end of the conversation. We don't have to talk anymore. So if I could change one thing in this school, and I do think, years and years ago, I had a conversation with Dr. Gitti Bentheim, who's on the executive board of the school, sort of the first lady of SAR, very wise woman, been a very important person in the life of SAR High School. And I was saying something I wouldn't say now. I was saying it's not us. We don't push college. We don't make the college pressure. It's the kids. It's their professional aspirations. It's their families. And she said to me, you can't do that. If your whole school community is feeling this way, if kids are feeling this way, you have to take responsibility for the ways you contribute to it. You can't just offload it to the kids, their families, and everything else and say, we don't pressure kids to, all have to apply to reach schools. They just pick that up from somewhere else. And I took that most very seriously. We also have to think about the ways that we contribute to it. But if you ask me something that I would want to change in the culture of my students' lives, if we go back to drinking, I buy that for at least some of our kids, Obviously, some of our kids drink to excess who aren't feeling pressured by college. But at least some of our kids, it genuinely is. I'm so stressed and so pressured
escape.
and so
Yeah.
frazzled and so fragile and so cracking and so anxious. And this is how I blow off steam. So you want to know what I want to change? That's what I want to change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it also leads to, anxiety is a lot more prevalent, or maybe
Yes.
it's just more focused on. I
Much
don't know.
more prevalent.
Yeah. And there's a book about it called The Anxious Generation. I haven't read it. I just wanted to point it out that it's very real, and I think a lot of it stems from the pressure on what you're saying, college, doing well in school. I mean, for me, I saw it with my two older siblings. I bet you did too. Your siblings went to great schools. My brother went to Ramaz, worked very hard. My brother's a workhorse, and he applied to 2 schools, Cornell and Bing, got into Bing, honors, but again, he got a job, he's great. My sister also worked very hard, was always studying, got into Emory, but then she went to the Army. She's not using her college transcript. And my sister always hammers home the point that it's like, my sister Mara is a very hard worker, but you shouldn't be breaking your back over high school because it's all going to work out in the end. And I kind of, as the third kid, the youngest, I didn't really break my back during high school, and I was maybe a little bit more relaxed. Not that I wasn't working hard, and not that I wasn't trying my best, and not that I wasn't taking classes I liked, which I did, but I wasn't going to do stuff just for the sake of college because I saw how it's all going to work out, as you said. And I also think that SAT and ACT pressure also is a huge thing with that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I like to call it the college matrix. And actually, coincidentally, this past Shabbos, I was at the park, and some 7th grade or I think 6th grade kids from MDS were talking about what high school they potentially go to, and they were like, "Oh, I might want to go to this high school because they get you into better college." And I was trying to hammer home the point that you should go to high school because you're going to high school. You don't want to go to high school because of a college that can potentially get you into. I think that's stupid. You should go to high school because you want to have the best high school experience.
It's like funny that you mentioned that because my son is an 8th grader in MDS, and this past summer he said to me that he was starting to worry about grades in 8th grade because grades in 8th grade already set you up to matter for college. And that was so fascinating to me because I know that as a home, we're not giving over this value. I have older kids who went to CUNY schools. I have an older daughter who's older than him, a daughter who's in Stern College for Women. We were not doing the apply to the highest ranked Ivy League you could get into. It's not our family's value. That's not what we were doing. I don't think that in my home kids hear your grades are the be all and end all. They certainly don't hear pick every class with the consciousness of the transcript. And yet a son of mine still in middle school is already worrying about how his grades in 8th grade set him up for. And so there is something really pervasive about this. So I'm just going to tell you some measure. I don't know if pushback is the right word, but whenever I talk about this, Rabbi Hartstark's counter is that we want kids to strive for excellence. We want kids to want to be great. We don't want kids to say, I'll take it easy and I'll laze around and it doesn't matter, which is very powerful and true. But I think the thing is that we want kids to be great, not we want kids to be A+ transcript. So find the thing you want to be great in. You want to be great in art, be great in art. You want to be great in Gemara, physics, music, whatever. Find the thing you want to be great in and pursue that. That's not what college pushes you towards is excellence or greatness. It pushes you towards a certain kind of transcript harping, grade grubbing, enormously anxious. I don't know what. I would love to see kids decide to be great in the thing they love or the thing they care about or the thing that matters to them, and not to feel like all I'm doing is trying to grind out A+ in every course because...
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not just what you learn, it's who you become. So
not just what you learn, it's who you become.
I think that's a perfect ending.
Perfect note to
Thank
end
you so
on.
much for
Thank
coming
you
on the
so much, Dr.
podcast. This was great. We are so honored to have Dr.
The
Schwartz come
longest
on
episode
here.
by far. So.
Easily. We
Yeah.
could have talked about so much more, but
Yeah.
we had to cut off at some point. This has been the SAR Experience with Saul and Caleb. See you guys.
See you next time.